First of all, thank you all for staying for the final talk. Thank you to the organizers for a wonderful conference so far. That is not mine. It's always fun when you're like at the start of your talk in front of like 300 people have to demonstrate that you still understand how technology works. It's like, I swear I have done this before. Okay. Let's see. By the way, if you want to see the story of the hacking the rifle, if you Google Wired, as in wired.com, and Runa and rifle, you'll get the 2015 story about hacking the rifle. But topic for today is securing journalists in 2022. If you're not super familiar with me or my work, I am originally from Oslo, Norway. I studied in Trondheim at NTNU, so I have a bachelor's in information security. I moved out in 2010. So I moved to London first. I did penetration testing for a small consulting firm for mostly financial clients in London, and then later on moved to Washington, D.C., and I've been in New York City now for the past, I think, almost 7 years. Very, very passionate about journalism security. Previously done work for the Tor Project, Freedom of the Press Foundation, and the New York Times, where I built the newsroom security program to complement the overall enterprise security program. So I was part of a security team of, I think back in 2016, there was about 6 people. I reported into the CISO, but I was physically sitting in the newsroom and building a program that just sort of focused on the security of the reporters. Since leaving the Times in late 2019, I was consulting. I was doing some work with the Ford Foundation. I have the sort of a small advisory role with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, in the US. And then this summer, I figured since I was already just doing this thing that I've always just done, I decided to finally just start my own company called Granite to continue doing this work. Over this past, year or so, also decided to start a sort of hobby research project to write about spies that used journalism as a cover, or journalists that also turn out to be spies. So if you're interested in that, you can find that on Instagram and Substack. So what are we going to cover today? I wanted to share some thoughts on, I guess, not so much how it started versus how it's going, but where I started and just how I saw the space that I worked in back then versus how things have shifted over the years and where we are now. We'll talk a bit about understanding how journalists and newsrooms work for those that aren't very familiar. We'll talk a bit about the risks that journalists face, exactly what it means for a journalist to work securely, and then finally how you can get involved in this type of work if that is something you want to do. And then I'll be happy to take questions at the end as well. So way back in 2009, I was a student. I needed a summer job. I found out about something called Google Summer of Code. So it's still around. Google Summer of Code is a Google-initiated project where Google will give nonprofit organizations around the world funding so that they can take on summer intern for open source engineering work during the summer months. And so 2009, I was just sort of browsing the list of all of these projects that were part of this program, and I found something called Tor. And initially, back then, I just thought it was really, really cool that you can use technology and lines of code to be anonymous online. That's it. I didn't really consider the ways in which that people use it. I didn't consider the ways in which people abuse it. I didn't consider the impact that it would have on the world. I didn't consider the problems that it might solve. I was just purely interested in it because you could be anonymous online, and I just thought that concept was really cool. In the end, I worked for the Tor project for about 4 years. And so it was really through that work that I got to see just the number of different groups of people around the world that greatly benefit from a tool like Tor and from the work that the Tor project is doing, and then coupled with that, the impact that I can have on the world with my work. So up until 2009, I didn't really consider having impact, doing something big, doing something good. I didn't really consider what I wanted to do with my skill set. That was, for me, something that was definitely shaped by the years that I worked for the Tor project. Now, back then, if you haven't used Tor at all, you should definitely go try it out. Back then, installing it was sort of like you had to install first Tor, then this companion software called Vidalia, then the Tor browser, and you had to like piece it all together in just the right way, and if you were lucky at that point, it would work. It would be really slow, and it wouldn't look super pretty, but it would work. Talking to people about Tor also meant that you had to talk to them about the difference between HTTP and HTTPS, and you had to sort of be able to communicate the importance of HTTPS. A lot of people had these questions of like, well, I have nothing to hide. Why should I use Tor? Why should I use encryption? Why should I care about these things? I have nothing to hide. And then the follow-on question, once you then explained Tor and encryption, was, well, isn't this just going to make me stand out on the wire? Because yes, if you are using Tor on a network, the network administrator will be able to identify that you're using Tor versus not. So in some contexts, that would mean that you stand out. There was a lot of talk about the dark web. So this was 2012, 2013, with the increase in drug markets on the dark web. So that was sort of seen as a very scary place to be. And in many ways, working securely meant that you sort of had to be a digital security expert. You had to understand how to use all of these different tools in like the exact right way to be safe and to like do it right. And any sort of slip up or configuration issue at any point along the way would mean that like your security model and your security tools just didn't quite work the way that you had envisioned. These days, though, for the past few years, I would say that encryption has sort of become almost mainstream. I think years ago, I think it was the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation in the US, created a browser plugin called HTTPS Everywhere, as more websites shifted from HTTP to at least making HTTPS an option. This plugin would check to see if there's a secure version of the site that you're on. It would then send you to that site instead of the unencrypted version. Over the years, HTTPS has become so easy to deploy and so quick and for free that it's sort of just become this like by default mainstream option. So when I now teach reporters on how to be safe online, I don't focus as much on the difference between HTTPS and HTTP as I used to. And I think that that is a really, really good thing. So there's been like this like changing narrative now. I think perhaps with the Snowden revelations in 2013, at least in the US, there was a big shift from I have nothing to hide, why should I use these tools, to, well, I have something to protect, and I know what you're going to do with my data if I don't. And I think that's just now become this like fairly standard seeing that we just know that there is data that we have, digital data that we have, that is worth protecting, and that doing so is just the right thing to do, that's not something that's seen as suspicious or as if we're actually hiding something. HTTPS everywhere, end-to-end encryption, I think, is now becoming the standard. I think over the years we've seen Signal has rolled out end-to-end encryption for messaging, WhatsApp, end-to-end encryption as well. Facebook Messenger has rolled out end-to-end encryption in its secret conversation feature on mobile. Telegram sort of kind of has its own version of it. Meta did at the start of the war in Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it made this announcement that for one-on-one conversation between Russians and Ukrainians, so in those two countries on Instagram, it will deploy end-to-end encryption for messages as well. So it's clear that that is a feature that they're working on, and I'm hoping that Meta can, over time, roll that out to the rest of the world as well. And it's just really showing how, for some period of time, right, HTTP, HTTPS, now the new default, new standard is end-to-end encryption. There's also a bunch of new neat tools. If you're familiar with Tor, there's now also Onion Share, which uses the Tor network to allow you to anonymously share files and folders. SecureDrop is a solution that allows, you can set up a SecureDrop instance to allow anonymous individuals to send you tips. So frequently used by a bunch of media organizations, some in Scandinavia. And then there's EOTK, it's the Enterprise Onion Toolkit that allows anyone to fairly quickly spin up a hidden service or like .onion site version of their website in, I think, relatively short period of time. So you'll have the New York Times, the BBC, the Guardian, bless you, the CIA all have sites on the dark web using the EOTK program. So back in the day, 2012, 2013, you sort of kind of had to be a digital security expert to make all of these things work and to be safe online. We are now definitely moving more in the direction of expert knowledge is not needed. Things just work. I think a lot of that comes down to what we do as engineers. We really put the focus on making sure that these things just work so that the end users, the people that we're actually helping, don't have to really think about all of these settings and features. They can just use the software and all the magic just happens on the back end. So George Orwell, at some point in time, said, journalism is printing what someone else does not want published. Everything else is just public relations. Now, if you're printing something that someone else does not want to see published, I can assure you that at some point, you are going to take a lot of criticism for it. So journalism is inherently risky work, both online and offline. Doing research into an individual or a company or a government or a hot topic where there are people who do not want you to do that type of research, that is in itself going to be a bit risky. And so envision now how just doing the research can be risky. There's going to be a period of time where you have to also then write the story. You have to fact check, you have to interview different sources, you do have to invite the individuals that you're reporting on to comment for your story. So at some point in time, they're gonna be aware that you're working on something, and then you also have to publish. And that in its own, I think, can be risky work depending on who you are, where you are, what you're reporting on, for whom, and we'll sort of get into a bit more of that. I, over the years, have sort of described that being a journalist is more than a 9-to-5, it's an identity. And that is to say that journalists, if they get a scoop on a Saturday, they will report on a scoop on a Saturday. There's been countless stories over the years of reporters that have reported out entire press conferences on their mobile phones because that is the tool that they had available at that point in time. If something happens on a Friday, breaking news, a journalist is going to be out there and report on that for the rest of the world to see. And thinking then about securing that type of work, you can't just account for the accounts and the systems and the different things that that person is going to use between the hours of 9 and 5. You really do have to think about securing this individual and securing the identity, because the work that they're doing really does encompass far more than just corporate assets. That work also requires support from, say, the business. So, for example, at the New York Times, you have the newsroom with, like, I think 2,000 reporters right now. And then you have the business side, which has, I think, your more standard, like, enterprise business units, like finance, HR, legal, IT. That includes the help desk, cybersecurity. And the work that the journalists do is also all supported by the business. So you have the IT staff that give out the laptops, that help them set up these laptops, that ensures that they're all up to date, that they have the software that they need, that they can get a new laptop if they're traveling somewhere. You have the legal team that ensures that legally they're not taking on too much risk with the stories that they write. You have all of these other units that just work to ensure that the journalists can do what the journalists need to do. Now, one thing that I've always found very, very fascinating with journalism work is that newsrooms are very, very deadline-driven and product-focused. So prior to my joining the New York Times in 2016, I always envisioned a newsroom to be very energetic, like almost to the point of being chaotic. I sort of envisioned like breaking news and people rushing around and like on the phone, and I thought it was going to be a very lively place. And turns out it's not. It is incredibly quiet. You just sort of see like a bunch of people, heads down, working. Maybe you hear someone on the phone, but no, otherwise it is actually really, really quiet. I remember a time in, let's see, this must have been, I'm thinking late 2016, where I was in the New York Times newsroom, Times Square, New York City, and a man had driven his car up on the sidewalk in Times Square. And the way that I found out about that, which just happened like 2 streets away from the office, was that a good friend of mine in Norway messaged me on Facebook to ask if I'm okay. I didn't hear about that from anyone in the newsroom. It was friends elsewhere who read the news. So just like a fun example. It also really means, though, that the solutions that I provide, have to be usable and reliable and secure. I think over the years, I started working with reporters back in 2011 when I was still doing work for the Tor project. And so over the years, as I've tried to figure out what's the right balance between all these like really, really nifty tools and technologies and the work that the reporters are doing and sort of the usability of it, like what's the right balance, I've also tried out a lot of different tools and techniques and workflows and sort of figured out for myself what's working and what's not. And it really just drives home that if the barrier is too hard, if you have a journalist attempting to write breaking news, and the solution that you provided, if the tool, if the CMS, if the thing that they have to use does not work, does not enable them to work with the speed that they need, they're just not going to use it. I think one other example that I can give is bring your own device, right? That's the super popular thing in most offices these days. If you give someone a laptop that is too old, too heavy, does not even look the right way, they're not going to use it. They're going to go for their new fancy personal laptop instead. If you want people to use the solutions that you provide, be it the technology, the physical one, or the software, it has to be usable and reliable as well. So in addition to the newsroom being very deadline-focused, deadline-driven, product-focused, you also are dealing with individuals who have different threats and concerns. And individuals in different parts of the world will have different threats and concerns. So for example, the New York Times has bureaus in a lot of different countries. The people that work in these different bureaus will have different threats and concerns. The physical security considerations in the different bureaus will be very different as well. So an example is the team working on investigations in a newsroom will have very different threats and concerns than the team writing obituaries. I think there's still going to be the same baseline, right? You want to make sure that they are using unique passwords and they have two-factor authentication turned on and they're installing their software updates. But there will still be things that you'd want the team on the investigations desk to do that would perhaps be overkill for the team writing obituaries. Similarly, the bureau in Moscow will have very different threats and concerns than, say, a bureau in Los Angeles or Stockholm or Trondheim. At the same time, individuals have different levels of tech comfort and knowledge. I think in some cases, you can have a journalist who's very, very familiar with technology. Maybe they even write some Python code. Maybe they scrape different websites. And that person can be paired up with someone who's not familiar with those things, who can use the CMS to publish a story because they've been trained on which buttons to click in what order. But aside from that, they're not super comfortable with new types of technologies. And so you really need to, at that point, find a baseline between the two of them of what is, for the project that they're working on, going to be the right set of tools and workflows that's usable and reliable and secure and allows them to just get the job done. Journalists frequently use a mix of personal and corporate accounts. I think just taking Twitter as a very good example, you have a bunch of reporters on Twitter. Twitter as a company consider those accounts to be personal accounts, but if a journalist's Twitter account gets hacked, that does also reflect on the media organization that they work for and the IT and security teams there. So again, accounting for security for a journalist and security for a whole newsroom does also have to account for any personal accounts that they use, including on social media. Now, years ago, when I first sort of started to do more work in the security space and sort of do more workshops and trainings and such, I am fairly certain that I, at some point, gave the advice of do not click on a link that you get from a stranger. If you don't know the sender, don't open the email or don't open the attachment. And I think that in some contexts, that advice, I think, still applies. I think it's not necessarily bad advice. Though, if you tell a reporter that they cannot click on a link from a person that they don't know, that sort of just falls for deaf ears. They're not going to pay attention to that because opening emails and clicking on links and attachments from strangers is sort of how they do interact with the public and how they receive news tips. So securing journalists and securing a newsroom does mean that you have to allow for and enable somehow securely clicking on links and opening attachments. So again, you have to enable inherently risky work, and you just have to find a way to make that doable. Now also, journalists deal with a lot of different types of risks and threats in, I think, every part of the world, from search and seizure of devices, arrest and torture, phishing, whether that's targeted or opportunistic. I think is still, in terms of digital attacks that I've seen on members of the media, phishing is at the very top of the list. Adware, malware, spyware, it's not all 0 days, but that's still part of it. In the US, over the past few years, there have been an increasing amount of discussion around online threats and harassment, the ways in which especially women and underrepresented groups are treated by members of the public. In the US, again, around election, abortion, there's a lot of hot topics that unfortunately does lead to online threats and harassment of reporters. It is happening in other parts of the world as well. I don't know to what extent it's happening in Scandinavia, but I would not be surprised if there's some of that here too. And then overall, again, in the US, a declining trust in journalism and the media. So, all that said, since I just served up a bunch of US-specific, I think, examples, I wanted to drive home that this is also our, as in Scandinavians, problems. These are not just challenges of journalists working in the US or in China or in Russia or in Qatar. Just an example to really drive this home is a year ago, 2 journalists within the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, NRK, went to Qatar to write a story about migrant workers. At the end of their trip, when they were about to travel home, they got detained at the airport and had all of their gear taken away from them. All of the material that they had captured, so all the photos, the videos that were on that gear got deleted. The journalists were sent home, and they were later given back the gear that they had with them. Now, I think it's a good thing that I think this story could have ended in a much worse way. But this just goes to show that here we have 2 journalists from Norway that in Norway do not necessarily have to consider the risk of arrest or seizure or physical threats or physical violence for the work that they're doing, but when they are covering certain topics in certain parts of the world, that suddenly does become a part of their threat model, and it is something that they do have to consider. Just a few days ago, a team of reporters were, I think, at least detained in the UK while covering a protest. A couple of years ago, journalists, I think Norway and Denmark, covered a very interesting story about an individual that had, he was a bit of an insider in North Korea, I think, if I remember correctly. So there are definitely important and sensitive stories being done by journalists in Scandinavia as well. And I just wanted really to drive it home, because over the years, I, at least personally, have sort of seen that there's talks that really focus on a US point of view, and that does not necessarily do a very good job of driving home that this also this all applies to the audience here. There's definitely work in this space here that you can support, that you can help with, and this is just one example. So in short, given all these challenges and all of these threats, it is pretty hard to just be a reporter. It's also pretty hard to work on security for reporters. Over the years, I have tried to talk about my work as doing cybersecurity for journalists. And for a long time, that was sort of purely what I focused on. Over the past few years, given all the challenges that I just described and the number of different sort of types of threats that journalists are facing, I've now tried to redefine what I do and how I do it, as my goal is to help you work securely. And that means that I have to account for physical, digital, emotional, and legal threats to the work that you do. I think that if I focus on security in just one of those 4 buckets, overall, that's not going to help you as an individual, as a person, to work securely. It's going to help you do a secure thing in one specific area. And I think at that point, I'm not fully having the impact that I can have. So just to give a good example of what I mean with covering security in those 4 buckets, back in 2012, you had John McAfee, the creator of McAfee, the antivirus company. I think he had sold it. He was living his best life in Belize. He, at one point, I think his neighbor was found dead, and the police in Belize really wanted to talk to him about his neighbor and what had happened that night. McAfee's response was to go on the run and hide out somewhere in the jungle in Guatemala, where he tweeted a lot about what he was up to and his innocence and whatnot. He tweeted a bunch. That's it. And so 2 reporters from Vice decided to go and meet with him in the jungle in Guatemala. And they then posted this photo that very quickly after it was published, other people noticed that the photo still contained the metadata associated with it, meaning Vice gave away the date and time the photo was taken, the location the photo was taken, and then also, as seen in the picture, at least 2 of the individuals that were there, including McAfee. And going back to the 4 categories of security that I said that I focus on, if we apply that to this specific example and sort of think about 2 journalists traveling from the US to Guatemala to meet with an individual who's wanted for questioning, who's currently hiding out in the jungle in Guatemala, right? Beforehand, there's probably some conversation about what they want to cover and what kind of story they're trying to do. Probably a conversation around what kind of equipment should they bring with them, laptops, cameras, phones, what else do they need, right? Because they're going into a jungle. Do they need flights? Do they need a rental car? Do they need physical security staff with them? Pretty sure traveling in this type of context can be somewhat stressful, so may also have been a conversation around emotional safety, well-being, self-care, all of those things. And then also legally, should 2 US reporters travel to the jungle in Guatemala to meet a man who's wanted for questioning in Belize? What are the legal implications of doing that type of story? And so now, I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if Vice considered digital security prior to this trip. I don't know to what extent they even considered that metadata could have been associated with the photo still. But I am pretty sure that they did talk about travel. I'm pretty sure they talked about physical security associated with the travel. Pretty sure they talked about the legal security associated with the story that they were writing. But this is sort of one example that shows that unless you account for security in all 4 buckets, you are likely to miss something along the way. So when I say that I focus on helping individuals work securely, I really do try to touch on security in those 4 buckets. And while I still do focus on the cybersecurity piece of it, the digital piece of it, over the years, I've tried to build connections with people who can at least advise on and support me with those other categories. So good security requires an understanding of current risks and threats. And I think if you look at a lot of the information that's been published online over the years, like we have a lot of data today to help inform risks and threats to date. You do have to be able to adapt as risks and threats evolve over time. Like I mentioned earlier, I have always sort of focused on passwords, 2-factor, full disk encryption, and updates being the sort of the baseline security package. And then from there, depending on who you are, what you're trying to do, what you're writing about, there's a lot of other neat tech solutions that you can use as part of it. So you can use something like Tails, you can use cubes, you can have travel phones, you can have travel laptops, you can use all sorts of different sort of workflows for encrypting the data that you're gathering or the ways in which that you're communicating. I don't think that today in 2022 that we're lacking the tools. I think that we have a lot of really, really neat tools for working securely, for storing data securely, for transferring data securely. But we are lacking, in some cases, the understanding of how to use these tools, when to use them, what the challenges are with each one, and also having that workflow for just making that part of our day-to-day. Like I said, if the tools that we develop are just sort of super easy to use and all the security and encryption and everything else is just sort of baked into it by default, that's a good thing because it means that the end users don't have to consider that themselves. And I think that's the direction that we need to go in. And I think that we're definitely getting there. And not everyone will understand these tools like Tails and cubes and whatnot. And so again, having that balance is key, and being able to meet people where they're at is really, really important. I think over the years, there's definitely I've had this personal shift of having gone from, if you want to do something securely, you have to do it in this exact way. And while from a technical standpoint. That's not necessarily wrong. It's just that in the real world, it sort of falls apart when you meet people who, for whatever reason, can't do it that exact way. So being able to adapt, being able to come up with new solutions, new way of doing things, and new workflows is really, really important, especially in this type of work. Also, I've talked a lot about encryption and security, and I'll also just say that encryption is not always enough. There's a pretty long article from Michael Lee in The Intercept from 2009 talking about the ways in which the Trump administration is using metadata to go after whistleblowers. And so it serves up a few different examples of whistleblower investigations in the US, how those investigations have started, and how metadata has sort of played a key part in at least narrowing down the number of individuals that the government would have to investigate. And this is, again, it's a US-specific example in the sense that it talks about US whistleblower cases, but it's certainly something that you can find examples for in Scandinavia as well. So I just really wanted to call out this article because it does a really good job of explaining some of the challenges that still exist even though we're encrypting content. And so that is a lot, right? There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's a fast-paced environment. Things either work or they sort of kind of don't work, and you're working with also human beings. And at the same time, security teams at media organizations are often underwhelmed and under-resourced. Like I said, when I joined the Times in 2016, it was 6 people. And so you had your analysts, you had your compliance people, there was a pen tester, there was a CISO, and me. And so security teams at media organizations do also focus on security for everyone else there, including HR and finance, IT, all the engineers with everything that they're doing. So it's understandable that they're then overwhelmed and under-resourced, and that doing security for the newsroom and supporting the journalists with all the challenges that that includes is a lot. Journalists have very sort of context-specific questions, like, hey, I have a source, how do I communicate with so-and-so? Or, hey, I got this file, can I open it? Or, hey, a source dropped off this USB stick. What do I do with it? And it's really hard to scale support for journalists, which just sort of adds to the challenge. You do have to talk to a lot of people, make a lot of friends. Like when I joined the Times in 2016, I think I spent a good chunk of at least the first 6 months just trying to talk to people, to understand what their concerns are. I had a good sense having done that work before, but I also didn't want to walk in and just say, hey, I know exactly what you need. So I met a lot of people, drank a whole lot of coffee, listened to their questions and concerns and thoughts on how to do things differently or better, or just to get a sense of where they were at. Because if you try to talk to someone about the importance of end-to-end encryption, but they're not necessarily familiar with two-factor authentication, you may be starting on the wrong end. So trying to figure out where the different groups of people in the newsroom are at, what they need, and then from there you can start to figure out, well, how do I build a roadmap from here, and exactly where is it that we're going? One challenge that I also ran into is that there's this difference, I think, in at least enterprises that have been around for a long time, that there's a difference in sort of views around how you approach security. There are the people that are reactive, like, I got a support ticket, let me answer it. Someone called without a specific question, let me answer it. A security incident is happening, let me respond to that. Versus proactively going out and saying, hey, I think that if you enable two-factor authentication on this social media account, that account will be more secure. Or, hey, if you're traveling to North Korea, I think that you should have a travel laptop. So we've set one up for you. In many cases, when it comes to security, people don't know what they need. In many cases, people just think that they're secure because why would their products be anything but? And so unless you then use your knowledge to go out and tell them that, hey, here are the ways in which you can work securely, or maybe this is the thing you haven't thought about, they're not necessarily just going to magically do the right thing. Also, especially in companies, given the mix of bring your own device and supporting people who also use personal devices and personal accounts for work, there is going to be a bit of a sort of friction between what is actually from a company point of view, what is our responsibility to secure and what is not ours. Do we just focus on the corporate assets and accounts? Do we help people with personal accounts? If someone's personal Facebook account is hacked, what do we do? I think that there's the answer of what is the right thing to do, and then from a company standpoint, what did the company say is the right thing to do? And I think those are some of the challenges that I do see, especially in media organizations, that may also just be a bit of a culture shift. I think that we're moving in a direction where security is seen as something that's just sort of core to the business, that it's part of the mission, that does require us to be a bit more proactive about security work. But I think that especially in organizations that have been around for a long time and can be slow to change, I think that is definitely a challenge that you'll see. So finally, to wrap up, I wanted to just say a few things about how you can help. If this is the type of work that you want to get more involved in, there are a lot of different ways to do it. Number one, Google Summer of Code is still a thing. So if you're a student, keep an eye out on the Google Summer of Code website. I think that they'll start listing organizations for next summer sometime around, I'm going to say March, April of next year. So definitely keep an eye on that. Remember crypto parties? Those were very popular a few years ago. I think they went away along with the pandemic, but I think we can definitely bring them back. That's a good way to connect with people in your community. It's a good way to practice your public speaking skills and also speaking to perhaps a non-technical or less technical audience. Tor Project, Freedom of the Press, Signal, all hiring, and you don't necessarily have to be based in the US. In some cases, you'll just have to be able to work in a US-friendly time zone, but that might still be doable. You can also secure at-risk people at a big tech company. So if you decided to go work for any sort of tech company, that doesn't mean that you can't focus on journalists and activists and asylum seekers and victims of domestic abuse. You can still do work for at-risk people, even if you work for any tech company or even a big tech company. There was a talk from Kenneth this morning about ethics. You can still apply all of these questions around exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve and for whom and for what purpose at a different tech company. Facebook has Facebook Protect, which is a program that aims to help at-risk individuals secure their accounts. Google has the Google Advanced Protection Program, which does the same thing for Google accounts. Apple just rolled out lockdown mode in iOS 16, again, a response to the types of attacks that certain at-risk groups of people have been seeing over the years. So even big tech companies like Google and Apple and Facebook, or Meta, are taking steps to do work for at-risk groups of people. So I just wanted to drive home that this is the type of work that you can do and the impact that you can have even if you're at a big company. So I will leave it there. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to chat on stage or also after the conference. Thank you so much.